I had bought a house without telling anyone, until I found my parents and my sister walking in. This story begins with what seems like a simple boundary: a woman buying her first home to finally have a space of her own. Yet the moment her sister forces her way in, claiming the house as a family property, the situation turns into one of the most compelling family revenge stories in recent memory. The narrative follows a quiet but determined main character who has spent her life being overshadowed, overlooked, and expected to give without receiving. When her sister crosses the line by moving in without permission, she realizes that reclaiming her space is not an act of anger, but an act of survival. As the conflict intensifies, this family drama reveals how favoritism, entitlement, and denial shape the dynamics between sisters and parents. Instead of explosive confrontation, the revenge comes through silence, boundaries, and decisive action. The result is not chaos, but clarity. The final outcome forces every character to face accountability, including a dramatic shift in the family's financial stability. For those who appreciate family stories told with emotional depth rather than melodrama, this is a reminder that family revenge does not always mean destruction. Sometimes, it simply means choosing peace and walking away. My name is Kendra, and this house was the first thing I ever built entirely for myself. I bought it with years of saved paychecks, careful decisions, and a level of independence I fought hard to earn. I had planned to tell my family eventually when I felt ready. To me, this home represented more than a place to live. It was proof that I could make something of my own without waiting for approval. That morning, when I pulled into the driveway and saw my parents' car outside, I tried to convince myself they might simply be passing by. But the moment I stepped inside, any hopeful thought disappeared. They were standing in my living room with my older sister, Lena. My mother was quietly inspecting the kitchen cabinets. My father was evaluating the layout like he was already deciding what should be changed, and Lena stood in the center of the room as if she owned it. She turned toward me, not with surprise, but with a calm certainty as though everything had already been arranged. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "This place works for me. I will move in this weekend." There was no question in her tone, no pause to gauge my reaction, no effort to ask whether I agreed. It was a decision presented as a fact made without me about something that was mine. I knew that if I argued right then, it would be treated as me being difficult rather than defending what belonged to me. So I stayed quiet, watched, and remembered every word and expression. That night, I changed every lock in the house. And that is where everything truly began. Before we go further, I want to know your thoughts. If your own family walked into your home and claimed it as theirs without asking, what would you do? Share your answer in the comments. I grew up in a family of 4 with my mother, my father, and my older sister, Lena. From the outside, we looked like a steady and ordinary family, the kind you might pass by at the grocery store and assume everything was fine. The truth was quieter, less visible, and it settled into the small choices people make without thinking. From a young age, Lena was the one my mother worried about. My mother always said that Lena was sensitive and easily overwhelmed, that life felt heavier for her than it did for most people. Whenever she struggled, the entire house adjusted to make space for her feelings. My mother would rearrange plans to help her speak to teachers on her behalf and smooth over the consequences of her mistakes. When I asked why the rules seemed different for her, my mother always had an explanation that sounded reasonable on the surface. She would say, Lena simply needed more support, that I was strong enough to manage things on my own, that it would be unfair to expect the same from both of us. I heard those words so many times that eventually I stopped questioning them. My father did not speak much about these things. He would sit quietly at the dinner table while my mother explained why Lena could miss another responsibility or why it made sense for her to receive help that I did not. His silence was not loud or dramatic. It was the kind of silence that suggests agreement simply because it avoids conflict. I learned early that siding with my mother was the easiest path for him and that my feelings would not be defended there. So, I adapted. If I wanted something, I would figure out how to earn it myself. When I wanted spending money in high school, I found a part-time job at a small cafe instead of asking. When I needed textbooks in college, I bought used ones online and resold them at the end of the semester. When I moved out, I furnished apartments slowly, one item at a time, always buying only what I could afford. I never felt resentment for providing for myself. What hurt was the way it was expected, as if independence had been assigned to me rather than chosen. It shaped the way I saw myself. I learned to keep achievements quiet because excitement could be mistaken for boasting. I learned not to ask for help because the answer had already been decided before I ever opened my mouth. Lena, meanwhile, built her life with the support she was used to. Apartment rent helped by my parents. Bills paid without discussion. Advice given before she requested it. If she changed her mind about a job, there was always patience for the transition. My mother's phrase, the one I had heard throughout my childhood, followed her into adulthood, too. Lena just needs more help navigating life. The words never changed, only the circumstances did. My decision to buy a house came from a quiet place inside me that had existed for years. It was not rebellion. It was not competition. It was simply the first time I allowed myself to have something that belonged entirely to me. I wanted a space where I did not have to play the role assigned to me, a place where I did not need to minimize myself so that someone else could be comfortable. I wanted certainty that no one could decide anything for me within those walls. The house became a boundary I had never been allowed to have before. I believed that once I created that boundary, it would be respected. I was wrong. A few months before everything unfolded, my life moved at a quiet and steady pace. I worked full-time at a small veterinary clinic in Maple Grove, a place where I knew every routine and every sound by heart. The clinic was not large, but it had a warmth that made long hours feel worthwhile. I spent most of my days caring for animals, speaking with owners, and keeping an eye on my dog Harvey, who often stayed in the office with me. Harvey was a mixed breed with soft ears and a patient expression, and having him near made the days gentler. During that time, I had begun to feel a subtle shift inside myself. It was not a dramatic realization, but a growing awareness that I wanted a space that reflected who I was. My apartment was small and temporary. It felt like a place where I was passing through rather than living. I wanted a home with room to breathe and a yard where Harvey could run without a leash. I began to search slowly at first, out of curiosity rather than intention. One morning after work, I drove through neighborhoods without any clear plan. Maple Grove had streets lined with old trees that formed slow-moving shadows across the pavement. When I turned onto a quiet road near the edge of town, I saw a house with a small yard and an open gate. I parked, stepped out, and walked to the backyard. The space was simple, quiet, and bordered by tall shrubs that created a sense of privacy. Harvey sniffed the grass and stood in the middle of the yard as if claiming it. The scene settled into me with surprising ease. I had found something that felt like it could be mine. I arranged a viewing later that week. The interior was modest but filled with soft afternoon light that moved across the floor in wide shapes. The rooms were not large, yet they felt balanced. I could picture myself waking up there, making coffee there, returning after long clinic days, and feeling a sense of restoration. The decision did not feel rushed. It felt like recognition. The practical steps came next. I applied for a mortgage, gathered documents, and spoke with the bank. I used my own savings for the down payment, savings accumulated through years of careful budgeting and quiet discipline. I selected each piece of furniture slowly, focusing on how each item made the space feel. I bought a kitchen table secondhand and refinished it myself in the evenings. I chose curtains that softened the sunlight. I placed Harvey's bed near the back door so he could watch the yard whenever he wanted. These decisions were not grand or expensive. They were thoughtful, shaped by a desire to build a place where I did not need to shrink myself. I did not tell my family. The choice was deliberate. I had learned many years ago that involving them in my decisions often meant losing control over them. I wanted to experience making a home without explanations or commentary. Silence gave me responsibility, and responsibility gave me peace. As the days passed, I cared for the house as though it were part of myself. I swept the floors each evening, trimmed the shrubs, cleaned the windows until sunlight moved clearly through the glass. Harvey followed me from room to room, settling wherever I paused, as if acknowledging that something meaningful was taking place. For the first time, I felt a quiet sense of belonging, not to a person and not to an expectation, but to a space that I had chosen and shaped. The house was not large, but it held something I had never been allowed before. It held room for me. It happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon when I had just returned from work and was settling into the familiar rhythm of preparing tea in the kitchen. The doorbell began ringing repeatedly, not in a patient or considerate pattern, but in a rapid insistence that felt like someone tapping directly against my ribs. I checked the camera on my phone and saw my parents standing on the porch with Lena beside them. They were not talking, only waiting, as though their presence alone should have been enough explanation. I opened the door because ignoring them would only lead to more escalation. The moment the door moved even slightly, they walked past me into the house. They did not look at me or ask if it was a good time. It felt as though they believed the space already belonged to them, and I was merely someone holding it open. Lena began wandering through the living room, running her fingers across the back of the couch, opening cabinet doors, and glancing at the photographs I had placed carefully on the shelves. She did not comment kindly. She tilted her head with a faint smirk that carried the weight of long familiarity. She said the layout was plain, that the rooms felt small, and that the backyard could use better maintenance. The words were not aggressive, but the tone was heavy with ownership, as though she was evaluating what would soon be hers. Mom walked behind her and said that it was nice I found a place spacious enough for everyone. Her voice held the smoothness of a decision already made. I told her that the house was mine and that I had purchased it for my own living. She smiled in the way someone smiles not because they agree, but because they do not believe there is anything to discuss. She said that Lena needed stability and that this house would offer it. She framed it as something natural, something I should have already understood without being told. Dad stood near the doorway with his hands in his pockets, quiet as always. His silence had become a form of complicity over the years. Lena continued her tour, stepping into the hallway and examining the second bedroom. She lingered in the doorway longer than necessary, nodding to herself as though confirming a private plan. She said this room would be perfect for her workspace. I reminded her gently without raising my voice that this house belonged to me. She responded with a laugh, casual and dismissive, as though I had said something adorably naive. When they prepared to leave, Lena stopped near the small hooks beside the front door where I kept spare keys. She looked at the set of keys without hesitation and took one. She did not ask. She did not look at me for approval. She placed the key into her bag and announced that she would move in over the weekend. The statement was delivered with the certainty of someone who believed no one would stop her. Mom nodded as though the matter was settled, and Dad avoided my eyes. I stood still, my hands resting on the back of a dining chair, and allowed the silence to grow between us. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead. I repeated that the house was mine, and that decisions regarding it were mine to make. Lena brushed it aside and told me not to be dramatic. They walked out, leaving the scent of familiarity and intrusion lingering in the air. When the door closed behind them, the house felt altered. Not physically, but in the invisible way a place changes when boundaries are crossed without permission. I stayed in the quiet, breathing slowly so I would not break the stillness with anger. I knew I would have to act. I also knew there would be no room for hesitation. The next morning arrived without any warning of the boundary that was about to be crossed. I had left for work early, taking my dog Harvey on a short walk through the quiet streets of Maple Grove before heading to the clinic. The day felt ordinary, steady, the kind that usually passes without leaving a mark. Yet when I returned home in the late afternoon, I noticed a moving truck parked near the curb in front of my house. My heart hesitated for a moment before reality assembled itself with clear intent. Lena was there, standing on the driveway while directing two men who were lifting a vanity table and several large suitcases from the back of the truck. She had one of my spare keys in her hand, and she walked toward the door like someone arriving at a place that already belonged to her. I approached and asked what she was doing, though the question felt unnecessary. Lena answered with a tone of lightness that disguised determination. She said she was getting a head start on moving in because she wanted the room to feel comfortable before the weekend. She inserted the key into the lock, pushed open the door, and walked inside. The action was so casual, so unbothered by the idea that permission should matter, that the air around us seemed to tighten. I followed her into the house and found the living room in transition. She had ranged the couch and coffee table, placed her boxes along the hallway wall, and was setting her makeup bottles on the dining table. The space had shifted away from me as if someone had reached into the center of the home and turned its pulse in a different direction. I asked her to stop. I spoke clearly, choosing each word with care because I knew anger would only feed her confidence. I reminded her that this house was not a shared property, that I had bought it myself, that I did not agree to her living there. She smiled in a way that suggested she had already predicted my reaction and dismissed it. She said that Mom told her I would eventually understand, that I always overreact about personal space, and that family should stay together when one person has the means to help. The words felt like a story that had been rehearsed long before this moment. I told her that understanding was not the issue. Respect was the first time that day. Her smile faded. However, she did not step back. She continued opening drawers, moving items, and folding her clothes onto the bed in the second bedroom. The tension did not erupt into shouting, but it settled deeply into the walls. I left the house to let the air settle and returned later in the evening. By then, the house looked wrong to me. It no longer reflected quiet and privacy. It reflected intrusion. That night, my best friend Lee visited after I called her. Lee and I sat at the kitchen table while Harvey lay near our feet. I explained what had happened, every detail, every word that had been spoken. Lee listened without interrupting, her expression steady. She finally said that boundaries only hold value when they are protected. She told me that silence was no longer an act of peace, but an invitation to be erased inside my own life. Her words did not ignite a sudden burst of fury. Instead, they settled inside me with calm certainty. I realized that if I allowed this to continue, I would lose more than a house. I would lose the one place where I could exist without being overshadowed. I knew what I needed to do. The decision was final before I even spoke it aloud. I would not share my home. I would act, and I would not apologize for reclaiming what was already mine. The morning arrived quietly, without hesitation or second thoughts. I woke with a feeling that had settled overnight, a steady conviction that no further discussion or compromise would follow. The house was silent, and the air carried a sense of clarity I had not experienced in a long time. I walked to the kitchen, brewed coffee, and took a moment to notice how the sunlight rested on the floor. It reminded me that this space was supposed to be mine, a place shaped by my choices rather than expectations that belonged to someone else. I finished my coffee, picked up my phone, and made the first call. The locksmith answered on the second ring. I explained that I needed all the locks replaced, including the front door, the back door, and the garage entry. I asked for the earliest available appointment, and he arrived before noon. When he worked, I stood nearby, watching each old lock being removed and placed into a small metal tray. The sound of the screwdriver and the quiet movement of tools felt like an undoing of something that had been creeping into my life without permission. The locksmith did not ask questions, and I did not offer explanations. When he finished, he handed me 2 new keys and showed me how the new lock mechanism worked. I thanked him and paid the service fee. There was no hesitation, no guilt, only relief. Next, I contacted a local hauling service to remove belongings from inside the house. I did not sort the items by sentiment or importance because they did not belong here to begin with. The crew arrived with a large truck and heavy gloves, and I directed them to every piece of furniture, every box, and every personal item Lena had brought into my home. The vanity table, the suitcases, the clothes, the perfume bottles arranged like small claims of territory, all of it was carried out of the house. The movement was steady and deliberate. There was no anger in the decision, and I did not feel cruelty in the action. I simply recognized that if I allowed these objects to remain, the intrusion would remain with them. The items were taken to the shared waste drop-off near the community collection site. I watched as the last box was loaded onto the truck. The house gradually grew lighter. The living room furniture returned to its original place. The hallway became clear again. The second bedroom regained its quiet. I walked through each room slowly, letting my footsteps be the reminder that I lived here, that I had earned the right to shape my own environment. Harvey followed me, resting his head against my leg when I stopped, as if he already understood the shift that had taken place. I did not call Lena. I did not message her. I did not contact Mom or Dad. Any explanation I could offer Ad already existed in the silence I maintained for years. They had interpreted silence as agreement. Today, silence meant conclusion. The boundary had been drawn with action, not with pleading or negotiation. For the first time, I felt ownership that extended beyond the physical structure of the house. It was ownership of my decisions, my voice, and my space in the world. When the house was clean and the air felt still again, I sat in the living room and allowed myself to breathe in the quiet. No anxiety followed. No doubt returned. The day moved forward without conflict because the conflict had already been resolved within me. There was nothing left to argue. I did not wait for apology or confrontation. Neither was necessary. I simply waited for Sunday. Sunday arrived with a sky that held no promises. The air outside was windless and heavy, almost expectant, as if the day itself understood that something long overdue was about to take shape. I spent the morning folding laundry and giving Harvey his breakfast, moving at an unhurried pace. Every movement felt intentional, as though the rhythm of the day depended entirely on the steadiness of my breath. There was no fear left inside me, only clarity, the kind that settles after a storm has already passed. Just before noon, I heard the sound of a car pulling up the driveway. The tires rolled across the gravel with familiar confidence. I did not need to look outside to know who it was. Then came the first attempt at the door, a firm twist of the handle followed by stillness when it did not open. A pause, brief and sharp. Then another attempt, more forceful. Moments later, I heard Lena's voice raised in disbelief, wrapped in outrage that came from a place far older than this moment. I walked to the hallway quietly, stopping where I knew she could not see me, and listened as she moved from disbelief to accusation. She shouted that I was being ridiculous, that this house was meant for all of us, that I was selfish for changing the locks without warning. Her voice struck the door with the same insistence she used to strike my boundaries my entire life. The fact that she could not enter was not simply an inconvenience. It was a disruption to the order she believed was permanent. The knocking grew harder. Then came the pounding. Then came her calling my name again and again with a tone that attempted to combine authority, disbelief, and injury. I did not answer. Eventually, the doorbell rang in frantic repetition, a sound that might have unsettled me once. Now, it was simply noise. My phone lit up with call after call. First from Mom, then from Dad, then a family group call request. I let every call pass. Eventually, I answered one. Mom's voice was sharp with urgency, the way it always became when she was defending Lena. She demanded that I open the door and apologize. Dad added that I should stop being dramatic. Their words formed a script I had known since childhood, smooth, practiced, unquestioned. I said only one sentence quietly, without bitterness. This is my home, and she does not live here. There was silence, the kind that opens up like a distance you cannot cross back over. Then Mom exhaled long and disappointed. She hung up without another word. A few minutes later, Lena stopped pounding on the door. The sudden quiet was heavier than the yelling had been. I waited there, still listening to her footsteps as they moved away from the house. The engine of her car roared, then faded down the street. I did not look out the window. That afternoon, she posted on social media. Long paragraphs about betrayal, about me abandoning family, about how she had been removed from her rightful home. The comments rolled in quickly. Some sympathetic, some confused, some eager for drama. None of it mattered. I blocked her account. Then I blocked Mom's, then Dad's, then the group chat. There was no announcement, no final speech, just the quiet click of disconnection. I walked to the front door. Harvey followed, his steps soft against the floor. I placed my hand against the wood for a moment, feeling its solid weight. Then I closed the lock gently, the sound small but final in the stillness of the house. There was nothing left to reopen. The door was closed. I heard updates slowly from the edges of people who once hovered around my family. None of it came directly to me because I had removed every channel that once connected us. Still, news has a way of traveling when a storm forms somewhere else. Lena lost her job first. The post she had written about me spread quickly, not in the righteous, triumphant way she expected, but in a way that exposed her entitlement. Her coworkers recognized the behavior. Her supervisor saw her treatment of others reflected in her own words. Within a week, she was asked to leave. She insisted it was unfair. She insisted she was the victim. But no one stood beside her this time. The audience she believed she owned had quietly stepped back. My parents wide to hold her up. They defended her the way they always had, with urgency, excuses, and financial sacrifice. Yet the debts she had ignored before began to close in. Credit cards, car payments, the lease she had signed impulsively. They sold my father's fishing boat. Then they sold a piece of land my mother had inherited from her grandmother. Their voices began to sound strained in the stories that eventually reached me, as if they were learning too late that responsibility cannot be transferred forever. Every action has a cost. Every person must carry their own weight eventually. I did not attend family gatherings that followed. I did not explain my absence. I did not provide closure in the form they hoped for. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to repair. A door closed stays closed when the person on the other side is finally free. Life settled into a quiet rhythm for me. I woke early, made coffee in my kitchen, and watched the light touch the walls that belonged entirely to me. I took Harvey, my dog, on long walks through the neighborhood, where the air felt wide and open. My home remained arranged exactly as I intended, each object placed with care, each room reflecting the steadiness I had once believed was impossible. There were no sudden calls, no footsteps entering uninvited, no shadows of expectation hanging in corners. The silence was not lonely, it was peaceful, it was earned, it was mine. I learned how to exist without being observed, without being taken from, without being defined by comparison. I breathed, and the breath felt full. I did not look back. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are the act of returning to oneself after years of being pulled apart. They are the recognition that love without respect is not love at all. I learned that protecting my peace did not make me heartless. It made me awake. It made me whole. The door I closed was not a punishment. It was a beginning. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of it resonates with your own experiences, you are welcome to share your thoughts. Your perspective matters. Your voice matters. I appreciate the time you spent here with me today. The story ends here. Now, let's listen to some music to relax.